Now permit me to tell you more about our impressive guest and featured speaker this afternoon. Lynn Vavreck is the Marvin Hoffenberg Professor of American Politics and Public Policy at UCLA. She's a contributing columnist to the Upshot at the New York Times and a recipient of the Andrew F. Carnegie Prize in the Humanities and Social Sciences. She is a prolific scholar whose research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation. In addition to this support, she has published dozens of prominent articles, so if you're a political scientist, you know her well. Dr. Vavreck is also the author of 5 books, including works described as the definitive accounts of recent elections: The Gamble in 2012, Identity Crisis in 2016, and I love this title, The Bitter End in 2020. So we'll have to ask her how bitter we're going to feel after this election, or whether we can feel ebullient. We'll see. She has served on the advisory boards of both the British and American National Election Studies. Political consultants on both sides of the aisle refer to her work on political messaging as required reading for presidential candidates. At UCLA, she teaches courses on campaigns, elections, public opinion, and the 1960s. Vavreck has also held appointments at Princeton University, Dartmouth College, and the White House. Today, she shall be sharing her rich insights and expertise as we have a countdown to the 2024 election. Big shout out to Rebecca for the emoji you saw with the person chattering on this. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vavreck to the University of Oregon.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you for that very kind introduction. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, yeah. Perfect. So thanks to everybody for coming out this afternoon. And we are going to talk a little bit about the bitter end. I heard some chuckles there when you heard the title of our 2020 book. And there's a connection to the bitter end in 2024 as well. So not being a mystery novelist, I'm not going to bury the lead. You are going to have to wait to the bitter end of this election to find out who's going to win. So if you came here today hoping that you would know with some certainty how this was going to go, I guarantee you that at the end of this, that is not where we're going to be. So I am going to talk about a lot of the work from this book, The Bitter End, that I wrote with 2 co-authors, John Sides of Vanderbilt University and my colleague at UCLA, Chris Tasanovich. And I'm going to talk specifically about this concept of calcification that comes from this book, but I'm going to marry it with a whole bunch of thoughts about the 2024 campaign and try to figure out what do we know about this moment in American politics. So in order to get us to 2024, I want to actually take us back to 2008. So in 2008, candidate Barack Obama met a man named Joe. That's Joe. Joe was a plumber. And he met Barack Obama on the streets in Ohio in 2008, and he said, I want to talk to you about your tax plan. So Joe's taxes were going to go up under Obama's plan to raise taxes on families earning more than $250,000 a year. And this was a big point of contention between Barack Obama and his opponent, John McCain. A couple of days later, John McCain meets Joe the plumber, which is how we all know him now, Joe the plumber. And this leads John McCain to say, congratulations, Joe, you're rich. Joe didn't really think he was rich. He was struggling. His business earned more than $250,000 a year, but he didn't feel rich. But according to Barack Obama, he was rich and his taxes were going to go up. And Barack Obama and John McCain fought about Joe the plumber and what his taxes would be for the better part of 3 weeks in the 2008 presidential campaign. Okay, this is Ohio in 2008. So now we're going to fast forward to 2024. In 2024, our politics feels, it seems, more divisive than what is the tax rate going to be on families right, we're talking now like raising taxes on families earning more than $600,000 a year. Whatever that value is, politics today feels more divisive, whether you're on the left or on the right. And in Ohio in 2024, something very different is happening. Instead of arguing about taxes, candidates are talking about immigrants in small towns in Ohio who may be taking their neighbors' pets for meals. So this is a very different kind of politics, and it seems and feels more divisive because it is. And what I want to talk about today is how can we understand that change in American politics? What is going on in American politics in the 21st century? And how's that going to help us make sense of what's coming in 2024? And the first answer that I'm going to give you to this question, how can we understand this moment and what has happened over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, is this concept of calcification. Okay, so calcification sounds like polarization, but it's not polarization. The way we think about it is that it's polarization plus, and the plus is really important. So I want to tell you guys what that is. The drivers of calcification are 4 things. And the first 2 are going to seem very familiar to you because this is what people think of when they think of polarization. Okay, so the first driver, an increasing homogeneity within the parties. So what does that mean? That means that Democrats are more like one another now in terms of their policy preferences than they have been, certainly in my lifetime, but since the civil rights era. Okay, so Democrats are more like one another. Republicans are more like one another in terms of the kinds of things they want to enact into legislation. So there's a homogeneity within the parties. If someone tells you like, oh, I'm a Democrat, you know a lot about what kind of world they want to build. That wasn't always true. In the 1950s, that wasn't always, that's not, 60s, no. This is a kind of new thing. Second driver is an increasing heterogeneity between the parties. So the kinds of worlds they want to build are farther apart than ever. They're very different. There's no overlap between the things that they want. So a sameness within party, but a real distance between. And that's what most people think of when they think of polarization. So to those 2 ideas, we're going to add 2 more, and this is the plus part, and this is what gets us to calcification. We're going to add the importance of identity-inflected or person-based policy issues to the conflict in American politics. So for a long time, we've been fighting about the New Deal, the role and size of government, the tax rate. That's Joe the plumber. That's the fight in 2008 on that street in Ohio. We are not fighting about those things anymore. We've had a shift. And what we're fighting about now are issues that are based in people's characteristics. Who gets to be an American? Immigration. Who gets to have membership in our national community? Is there going to be a religious test to enter the country? Abortion is a person-based issue. Who gets to use which bathroom? Who gets to play on which sports team? These are all areas in which we are writing or we will have to write policy in the next 5, 10, 15 years. This is what's coming for us. And so the rise of these identity-inflected issues has changed the tenor of our politics. They are a lot harder to compromise on than the tax rate. Joe the plumber and Barack Obama could have had a very long conversation on that street, and Obama could have said, okay, I'll tell you what, Joe, I'll make you a deal. Instead of raising your rate by 5%, I'm going to raise it by 2.5%. And they both could have felt like they got a little. They gave a little, they got a little, bargain and compromise. It is a lot harder to bargain and compromise on these identity-inflected issues. Same-sex marriage. You can't be married on Monday and Tuesday not on Wednesday and Thursday, and on Friday only if you want to be, right? We've got to have one policy. So the rise of these issues has added to the stickiness of our politics. And then the last driver of calcification is just something that happens to be at this moment in time, and that's a rough balance in the electorate between people who call themselves Democrats and people who call themselves Republicans. We just happen to be sort of split. So that is going to produce all kinds of strange externalities. When we're split like this, and we're fighting over issues that are really divisive and hard to compromise on, and the other side is really far away from you, that is going to make entertaining a vote for the other side seem really impossible. And that produces calcification. Like it does in the human body, right? Calcification makes our bones stiff and rigid. Calcification is making our politics stiff and rigid. It's very hard to think about voting for the other side. Calcification also makes the stakes of winning elections very high. Right? It matters who wins because the other side is farther away than ever on these divisive issues on which people have very strong opinions. And here's the thing, because of the partisan parity, victory is always just within reach for each side. Back in the old days, one party would lose. After 2012, when the Republicans lost, they went back and they gathered and they wrote what is now called the autopsy. It's a 100 and some page report called the Growth and Opportunity Project Report for the Republican Party. And they laid out a whole plan. They said, hey, people are not buying what we're selling. We got to sell something else because we don't have market share. People aren't buying it. Okay, that is not where we are today. Today, victory is, Donald Trump lost the 2020 election by about 30,000 votes in 3 states. Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 by about 77,000 votes in 3 states. So these elections are on the knife's edge. So now when a party loses, they don't go back and say, hey, people aren't buying what we're selling. A lot of people bought what you sold. You almost won. And that produces these strange incentives to, hey, we don't want to change our pitch. We just need the rules of the game to be different. If we can change the rules of the game, we could win next time. And so instead of changing what they're selling, parties might look to change the way votes are counted, change who gets to vote, right, change the rules of the game. Okay, so calcification has some serious externalities that we want to keep thinking about as we work through how to apply this to 2024. Okay, so essentially, the question in front of voters is, whose world do you want to live in? Right? The left or the right? And they're really different. The most important issues are the ones on which it's hard to compromise. People know this. Okay, so people understand that the parties are offering very, very different visions of the future. So to show you this, I'm going to show you data from the American National Election Study, which is our federal government's longest survey of political attitudes. It's actually the longest survey of political attitudes in the world. Started in the 1940s in the US. So I'm plotting for you here 1952 up into 2020. And this is the share of people who say that they think there are important differences between the two political parties. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, you can see here it's roughly half of the country say they think there are important differences between the two countries. And if you think for a little bit about why that might be, on some issues there were really very few differences between the two political parties in the 50s and 60s and 70s. As we start moving through the decades, you see that number of people goes up and up and up. By the time we get to 2020, 90% of the population is telling survey researchers they see important differences between the two political parties. That is nearly everyone in the population. That's 9 out of 10 people. Anybody you go out and ask, oh yeah, the parties are really different. So this is important. The parties do want to build very different worlds, and people know it. So that is happening at the same time that people are also having different emotional reactions to the political parties. So here again, the American National Election Study, I'm showing you the ratings of your own party. So you tell us what party you're in, and then we ask you on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is really cold and 100 is really warm, how warmly do you feel about the political party that you are a member of or that you identify with? And you can see here that in the 1970s, people are giving it about a 71, out of 100. Okay, and that's pretty constant. We switched to doing online interviews at the end of this period, but it pretty much stays the same. People like their political party about as much as they ever did. But look what's happening to their rating of the other party. People like the opposition a lot less than they used to. 50 is neutral on this 0 to 100 scale, neither warmly nor coldly. And back in the 1970s and 80s, people were like, other party, I could take it or leave it. But as we move through the decades, and by the time we get into the 21st century, people are having very negative reactions to the other party. So they want to build different worlds, people see it, and people's emotions are now more connected to those differences. They like the other party a lot less than they used to. Okay, so let's keep all of that in mind as we look to see if we can see any effects that look like calcification in data on elections. Okay, so I'm going to try to show you some evidence for calcification at work. We're going to start by looking at calcification in the US states. Okay, so what I'm showing you here are election outcomes. So let's start with this, this upper left quadrant. On the horizontal axis, I'm showing you Barack Obama's share of the two-party vote in 2008 in all these different states. Each one of these dots is a state. Okay, so there's 50 dots. So what did he get in Utah, in Wyoming, in West Virginia? On the vertical axis, I'm showing you Barack Obama's share of the two-party vote in the next election, in 2012. And I've drawn a 45-degree line here in this figure to help us appreciate that if every state had exactly the same outcome, if he got 50% of the vote in 2008 and 50% of the vote in 2012, if every state does exactly the same in both years, all these dots are going to be on the line. Okay, so they're not on the line in this figure. They're all pretty much below the line, with the exception of Alaska, which you can think about what Alaska has to do with the 2008 election. So the dots are below the line. What does that mean? This figure is telling us that between 2008 and 2012, Barack Obama lost vote share almost everywhere. He's doing less well in almost every state in 2012 relative to how he did in 2008. That's the shine coming off Barack Obama a little bit. After the global financial crisis, he got a boost. 2012 is a little bit back to equilibrium. Every state is moving back to maybe a normal, what we might think of as a normal Democratic vote share. So this is a uniform swing, all the dots moving in the same direction. And that's pretty typical of what we see. If I drew you these pictures going back in time, we would see dots going up and down, but mostly together. Okay, so now let's look at the Democratic share of the vote in 2012 relative to the Democratic share in 2016. So this is Obama's vote in 12 versus Clinton's vote in 16. And it's just two-party votes. So you can think of this as like the same story for the Republicans. I'm just showing it for Democrats. So what do we see here? Well, this is kind of a mess. There are some dots that are above the line. What does that mean? That means that Clinton did better than Obama in Texas, in Arizona, in California. Okay? But some of the dots are below the line. What does that tell us? Clinton did worse than Obama in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan. Okay, well, that's starting to sound like a familiar story that we all remember from the 2016 election. But the fact that these dots are varied in how they moved is important, because this is the reshuffling of politics in America off of that New Deal coalition, the argument about the role and size of government and taxes, and onto this new dimension of conflict that Trump brought in 2016, these identity-inflected issues. Now, he's not creating those attitudes. Those attitudes existed in the population long before he came down the escalator in 2015. But he is giving voice to these attitudes and giving people permission to join him in saying these things out loud. And then what happens? Hillary Clinton fights him on those issues out loud, and all of a sudden, that's what we're fighting about. And the middle class, the rise of the middle class, and the middle class economy, and taxes, and what government can do for you, that is in the rear view in 2016. Having established that as a new dimension of conflict, having won in 2016 and shown Republicans that that's a winning strategy, it will be very, very difficult. I would say, well, I'm just gonna say it's very, very difficult for us to go back to fighting about those things. So now let's look at 16 to 20. And this is where we see calcification. So here, Clinton's share in 2016, Biden's share in 2020. You're all experts at these figures now. What do you see? Almost all the dots above the line. But man, are they really close to the line. They're almost on the line. So on average, across all the states, the difference in the Democratic share of the vote in 2016 relative to 2020, the average difference was about 1.5 points. That's a replay. That is the 2020 election being a replay of 2016, despite a global pandemic, no campaigns, campaigning from your basement, drive-in rallies, despite mail-in ballots to like everybody, despite the largest social justice movement since the civil rights movement, all of these unexpected things. And the 2020 election is basically a replay of 2016. That's calcification. It is so hard for people to entertain a move, to vote, to give the other side a chance. Right? They're too far away. And so these elections are just repeating themselves. Okay, so what's 2020 to 24 going to look like? I would say, if you were betting money, you would bet that it's going to look something like this. Maybe, maybe even closer to the line, honestly. We'll see. Okay, so now let's push it down a level. That was state level. Now let's look at the counties. So here I'm showing you the same idea, the absolute swing in county Democratic vote share, so two-party vote share. How much county by county is the Democratic vote share changing year to year? Okay, so this is the absolute value of the change. Starting in 1952, going all the way forward to 2020. So you can see, like, in some years, the average county swing, the absolute value of the swing is up near the 20s. Like, that's huge. A 20-point swing in Democratic vote share, right, average in the counties. There are 3,157, something like that, counties in the United States. Okay, so, but as we move through the decades, that's getting smaller and smaller. By the time we get to 2020, it's the smallest change, county by county, that we have seen. Whoa. Oh, okay. AI is listening. Okay, since the 50s, it's about somewhere right around 2.5 points or something like that. That's crazy, right? Despite all the craziness of 2020, the average county change is about 2.5 points in the Democratic vote share. That's calcification. Okay, so now let's take a look at individual level, person level. So we have panel data. That means we're interviewing the same people over time. And we start interviewing them in 2011. And so we know how they voted in 2012. We know how they voted in 2016. And we know how they voted in 2020. And this is a project called the Views of the Electorate Research Study, or Voter Study. It's run by the Democracy Fund. And so we're going to read these across the rows. So conditional on having voted for Barack Obama in 2012, how many of Obama's 2012 voters voted for Clinton in 2016? 81%. So she held on to 81% of Obama's voters. She lost 9%. She lost 9% of Obama's voters to Trump. That's a lot. Okay, Mitt Romney, right, conditional on voting for Romney in 2012, Trump held on to 84%. He lost 5% to Clinton. These don't add up to 100 because I've left out other and I didn't vote. Okay. But now let's look down here. So this is what I call the bleed. This is what you've lost. If we look at 16 to 20, conditional on having voted for Hillary Clinton in 16, 95% of those people voted for Joe Biden in 2020. He only lost 2% of Clinton voters. And Trump held on to 94% of his voters. He only lost 2% to Biden. 2 compared to 9 and 5. Right? This is calcification at the level of the person. So at every level, state, county, and person, we're seeing people changing less. States changing less, counties changing less. Okay, so I want you guys to remember these tables. These are called transition tables, and we're going to come back to this at the end, and I'm going to show you 2020 to 2024, and see where we are today. Okay, so I want you to just remember that these numbers were 95 for the Dems and 94 for the Republicans. Keep that in the back of our mind. Okay, so given calcification, is there any room for the campaigns to matter? Okay, so I am this person who is a campaigns and elections scholar, and I think campaigns matter. So this is like a real test of my constitution here. Like I've written this whole book about how everything's stuck. So what does that mean for the campaign? So the thing about calcification is that it's producing these elections that are on the knife's edge. But calcification doesn't mean the same party wins every election. It just means that the outcome is going to turn on very few votes. That means the campaigns really matter. Okay, there are fewer people up for grabs. Persuasion is a lot harder than it used to be. That slice of people who are movable is smaller than it's ever been. But those people are still pivotal. It's important to get their votes. I don't want to say they decide the election because your base has to turn out. You got to mobilize all your people. This is like when the students come to me and they say, the B you gave me in class kept me out of law school. That wasn't my B. It was the B you got your first quarter of school when you were a freshman. Right? All the B's matter. So it's not that those people in the middle are pivotal. Like they can pivot the outcome, but they're not the only people who matter. Okay. But they are important. You got to win their votes. So yes, we're going to talk about why the campaign is still important. Okay. So the way I think about this is there are 3 things that structure every presidential campaign. The first is the state of the nation's economy, and that is going to set the stage for the play that we're about to see, the play being the 2 campaigns. The economy is still important to setting this stage, even though we're not fighting about the New Deal anymore. It's still going to help us figure out who's advantaged on the economy, and maybe should they be talking about that a little bit. So, state of the nation's economy, very important. The second thing that structures every presidential campaign season are the candidates themselves. Who are they? What constraints do they have? Have they been in government a long time? Have they taken positions on lots of things? Have they negotiated a peace treaty? Did they build weapons? Did they bomb something? Did they end a war? Did they start a war? All of these constraints. Are they old? Are they young? Do they have experience? Do they have none? This all matters a lot. Not maybe for the reasons you think, but we're going to tell you why it matters. And then the last thing is what they do with number 1 and 2. How do they use the state of the economy and who they are and who their opponent is to craft a message and try to frame the election for you, to advantage them? So we're going to take these in turn. We'll start with the state of the economy. So this is a well-known regularity in American political elections. A growing economy is good for incumbent political parties. This is true in all democracies. So what I'm showing you here is the GDP growth rate in the first half of every election year since 1952. January to June of the election year, what's the growth rate? Okay, so each one of these plotting symbols is an election, presidential election outcome. On the y-axis is the incumbent party's share of the two-party vote. And I have fitted a line through these plotting symbols for you. And you can see that as GDP goes up, incumbent party vote share goes up. Growing economies are good for incumbent parties. They are even better for actual incumbent presidents. Okay, you get a little boost if you're the actual person who brought about the good economy. Here's 2020. Okay, so COVID, we had a very bad first 6 months because of the pandemic. Would not expect the incumbent party, that would be Trump, he's the actual incumbent, would not expect him to get over 50%, would not expect the incumbent to win, and the incumbent did not win. Okay, where are we in 2024? We're somewhere sort of right around in here. So 2-something% in the first 6 months, that should put us well over 50%. Okay, so that should be good for the incumbent party. If you are the Democrats in 2024, based on the growth rate, you look out there and you say, historically speaking, this is ours to lose. Okay, but it's 1992. Nobody feels the growth. So in 1992, George H.W. Bush went around saying to people, I don't know what everybody's talking about. The economy is growing like gangbusters. What's everybody so upset about? And Bill Clinton in 1992 came along and said, sure, the economy's growing, but it's a jobless recovery, and there are no jobs. And I know that you all know that. I don't know why he can't see it. It's the economy. That's what we should be talking about. Everybody thinks of that election as Bill Clinton winning because it's the economy, stupid. What's crazy about that is that the economy was actually growing. Right, but his story was we need change versus more of the same. We need a new economy. We need new jobs for this 21st century economy that's coming. This is a jobless recovery. I'm going to bring you change. Oh yeah, and don't forget health care. That was his story in 1992. And that's what's happening in 2024. Joe Biden is out there. He's, I don't know what you guys are talking about. Like, we are doing great. Look how far we've come out since COVID. Come on, quit your whining about inflation. He didn't really say that, but that's the vibe that he was giving off, is look, we've done so much, comparing you to other countries. We're doing so much better. Not really feeling your pain. Okay, so what was Trump doing? He was leaning in on this and saying, when I was president, 2024 was shaping up to be super weird. 2 incumbent presidents, 2 guys who had been president. That's weird. That's only happened one time in American history before. So when I was president, you didn't have these kinds of economic problems. So put me back in. So we got Trump talking about the economy when it really should be the Democrats that are benefiting from it. This was kind of a mess. Okay. All candidates come with constraints. Your job is to leverage your strengths relative to your opponent's constraints. Okay, so that's going to change depending on who you're running against. So I wrote this book on campaigns, and I wanted to interview people who had run for president. And I was able to talk to Michael Dukakis. And I said to him, tell me how you thought about what issues to run on in 1988. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And he just literally looked at me and he said, what are you talking about? He's like, I've been in politics my whole life. He literally said my name. He said, Lynn, I stand for things. And I was just like, wow, that is why you lost, right? Like, yeah, you stand for things, but it really matters who's standing next to you. Okay, you have to leverage your strengths relative to their constraints. There is no better way to make something irrelevant in a presidential election than having both candidates take the same position on it, right? If I'm old and you're old and we're running against each other, age is not going to be an issue in this election. So Biden could not go around saying, Trump, he's slowing down. He's aging. He can't do the job anymore. Put me in. That's absurd. You can't make that argument because the guy standing next to him and he are the same on that. Okay, so when it was a Trump-Biden race, we didn't really hear about age and experience because that was neutralized. But when the race becomes a Trump-Harris race, you can see this is the best example of this. All of a sudden, this new avenue of framing the election opens up, and she immediately goes there. We're not going back. We're going to turn the page. Turn the page is a phenomenal way to frame the election. What does that mean? Turn the page on these two old dudes? Yes. Turn the page on the Trump years? Yes. Turn the page on just all the chaos of the past, the COVID, we're just going to turn the page. Yes. The fact that I started with that politics feels divisive, that works for her when she says turn the page. You don't like the way it feels? Turn it. Joy, come with me. Okay, the secret is it's not going to change. The issues are still going to be divisive. They're still going to be hard to compromise on. But in terms of framing the election, this opens up for her because she's different than Trump on this. And Biden was not. So she's going to leverage that, and she's going to build a messaging strategy around that. They know they are the incumbent party in a growing economy, so they should talk about the economy. Trump also knows that he is not the incumbent party in a growing economy, and so he needs to find something else to talk about. When Biden wasn't owning it, he was portraying Biden as being sleeping on the job of the economy. But when Harris starts to talk about the opportunity economy, and we got to keep this growth going, and I know you're hurting, but here's what I'm going to do for you, Trump is not unaware of this, and he pivots. So he now knows that he can't win on the economy, and so he's got to refocus the election onto some other issue on which he's closer to most voters than Harris, and where Harris is constrained. This works out so well for Trump because this is just from his songbook. He's going to go back to immigration and to identity-inflected issues, which is how he started in 2016. He did this a little bit in 2020, blue state, tell your governor to take back Michigan. These blue state governors want to shut down the country. You got to tell them. He sort of tried to make the pandemic about being a Democrat or a Republican. But in 2024, he's squarely back in 2016 songbook territory. So when it was Trump-Biden, Trump was saying the economy is bad, and Biden was saying democracy is under threat. You can't put this guy back in. Democracy's on the line. now that it's Trump-Harris, Trump is saying we have to stop immigrants from coming to this country because they are causing a crime wave. And Harris is saying, come with me, turn the page on the past, embrace freedom, a generally Republican principle, embrace freedom, and help me create an opportunity economy for the middle class. And that's where we've landed. And both of these candidates are doing exactly what they should be doing. She's talking about the economy, and he's trying to reset the agenda onto something where most voters do think immigration is a problem. They do think that crime is rising because of this. He's closer to most people on this than she is. So he wants the election to be about this. She wants it to be about the economy. She is not doing the thing Hillary Clinton did. She will not engage with him on this. She is basically, I think she probably wakes up every day and says, do not talk about immigration, right? Like, you know, she went to the border, but they did it on their terms. When he throws out the bait that he wants her to catch, she doesn't. Hillary Clinton did. And then we were always talking about Trump's conversation, not Clinton's conversation. Harris is not doing that. Okay, and I just have some examples of, you know, this is Trump trying to, you know, reset the agenda. One really violent day of crackdowns is going to end crime in the country. This is a couple days ago. And then this is a script of a Harris ad talking about how Trump is going to raise taxes on the rich, and I'm going to give middle class people a tax cut, people like you. Okay, so talking about the economy. I'm going to skip this. These are some testimonials from voters, just underscoring that voters, this is from NPR, this is getting through to voters. So they're talking about the economy, they're talking about abortion, and they're talking about immigration. Both candidates, their messages are penetrating the electorate. This is from just from like last week. Okay, so this campaign is really shaping up to be exactly as we would expect it. It's really close, it's on the knife's edge. The messaging strategies make a lot of sense given what the state of the economy is. So where does that leave us with campaign effects in this time of calcification? So now I want to go back to a little bit of data, and I want to show you that last transition table. So I'm going to use data now from YouGov, a project that they're calling SAY 2024. And they've done a huge number of baseline interviews in December of 2023. And then they're re-interviewing these people all throughout the year in 2024. So again, we have panel data. We know what people said in 2023. And in fact, all of these people had been interviewed in 2020 as well. So we know how they voted in 2020. We re-interview them in 2023, and then we re-interview them again throughout the weeks of 2024. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide 2024 into periods of the campaign that I think are interesting. And those are going to be from January to June, so until the first debate in 2023. That's going to be period one. Then I'm going to do the week of the debate, leading up to the debate. Then I'm going to do after the first debate to the shooting, to Trump's shooting. Then I'm going to do the time after the shooting to the time that Harris gets the nomination, right? So this period, number 4, this is the period that's going to pick up what is the effect of the assassination attempt on Trump before Harris gets the nomination. Then I'm going to do after Harris is nominated and after the Democratic National Convention. So 6 periods, we're going to try to see what campaign dynamics look like. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is these are numbers from those transition tables. So remember when I said, remember the 95 and the 94? That's what this is. But I didn't want to make one table for each one of these periods. So I'm just showing you, this is the Republican number. This is the percent of Trump's voters, his 2020 voters. This is the percent that he's holding on to from January to June of 2024. So yeah, that's less than the 94%, right? So he's losing some of his 2020 voters. and Biden is losing some of his 2020 voters. So they each have a lot of those red numbers from the table, right? They're pretty big here. We're going to move through time. The week of the debate, Biden is already losing some of his voters before the debate even happens. People are like, I don't know about this. Okay, let's stay on the Biden line. After the debate to right before the assassination attempt, he loses almost 2 more points. Okay, but not 10 points. People are like, wow, it's a disaster. Okay, well, he didn't lose that many people. But by the time we get to the assassination of Trump, really peels people away from Biden. Okay, so from where he starts in January to June at 82, by the time we get to the Trump assassination, he is down to only holding on to 3/4 of his 2020 voters. That's unbelievable. Okay, so that's a lot of people. We could look back over many, many, many years to the 1950s, and it would be, it would be hard to find ones that were bigger than this. So he's lost a lot of his voters. Then he's out, Harris is in, and boom, we're back up to 86% of the 2020 voters are now back in the Democratic fold. So that's a big effect, more than he had in the beginning. She's recouped more voters than he even ever had. And then now she's up close to 90%. Okay, here Trump is holding steady in the high 80s. So after the debate, he picks up he gains a couple of his voters back. Then after the assassination attempt, there's not a big effect for him, but once Harris gets nominated, Republicans are coming home to him. Okay, so it's interesting. There are lots of interesting things about this, but 2 that jump out at me. It's the thing that happens to the other party that is motivating in-party people to do things. I think that's interesting. So here, his supporters are coming home to him after Harris gets the nomination. Now, we don't want to make a lot out of this. We're also getting closer and closer and closer to Election Day. These voters are going to come home. Okay, if Biden had stayed in, these people, they're coming back to him. It wasn't going to be 76, 72, 70. That's not what was going to happen. He was going to go out and give a great speech, and all those people who left were going to they were going to come back. Okay, but they come back faster. Not all. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Not all of them, but most of them were going to come back. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you, and then I want to talk to you about what you want to talk about, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to look at the share of people who said, I'm not sure who I'm going to vote for in December of 2023. So these are people who are like, I don't know. And we're going to look at how they're breaking over these periods. So in January to June, it's a rough split. People who said, I don't know who I'm going to vote for in December of 2023, as we move through the first 6 months, they're breaking pretty evenly for Trump and Biden. And it's even, it's a slight Trump advantage going into the debate. But then, in the period after the debate, up until Trump gets shot, the Biden share stays the same, but fewer people are saying they're going to vote for Trump. Okay, so the debate actually, in terms of moving the people who weren't sure, it seems to have had more of an effect on Trump than on Biden. And then after the shooting, though, he gets more of the not sure voters. Okay, so bad debate, but then he survives the assassination attempt, and the not sure voters are like, oh, yes, they're breaking for Trump now, not Biden. But then Harris gets the nomination, and boom, that's a big effect, right? The not sure voters, now they're like massively breaking for Harris, and then after the DNC, even more. Okay, so what is the split? This has nothing to do with sort of what the party identification of these voters are when they start, but I will tell you that among the people who say, I'm not sure, of which it's about 5 to 6% of the electorate in December of 2023, there are slightly more Democrats than Republicans, not a lot more. Okay, so it's not totally even. There are a few more Democrats than Republicans, which is just sort of should set your expectation that if everybody comes home to their party, we would see the blue line always ahead of the red line. But it's not always ahead, and this period is very interesting. Okay, sorry, didn't mean to do that, but that's good. Okay, so what does all this tell us about 2024? Both candidates are leveraging their strengths, given the conditions that they find themselves in and who's running against them. Calcification means that there are very few voters who will consider a vote for the other side. So you've really got to, you got to get your partisans back to you. That's a big part of what's happening, and you got to get people out to the polls. And basically, this is just a fight to the bitter end to Election Day. And the only prediction that I'm willing to make is that I think the outcome is going to be very close. And I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to take your questions. Okay, why don't we start? We'll start in the back, and then I'm going to come up front.
Regarding calcification, it's often attributed to, or at least an important driver, is our information environment, information silos, and how that has changed over the last 20 years in particular. My question is there any data to either support or refute that premise?
Well, we definitely know that people like to hear information that they agree with. So there's no denying that. It doesn't mean that people aren't exposed as a byproduct of their lives to information on the other side. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are out of touch with reality. So one of the results that I really like is that first figure I showed you where 90% of people see important differences between the two parties. There are important differences between the two parties. They're pretty big, and people seem to know that. That gives me confidence. I'm not one of these people who is going to say democracy is breaking because of choice, media choice. I think that, you can say, the argument I hear most often, I don't want to say you're saying this, but the argument I hear most often is that, my mom and dad, I got to get them off Fox News. They're believing all this stuff. And I think what my friends who say that don't realize is that their mom and dad like Fox News because they thought those things to begin with. And so we have to be careful about which way we think the arrows are going. People think it's everybody's a blank slate, and then they watch Fox News, and then they believe these things. And that is not quite right. People believe things, they watch Fox News. Fox News is a business, and they say the things that they know people want to hear. Would it be better if everybody, I also have a lot of friends who can quote me line by line for whatever was said on MSNBC that morning. And that makes me roll my eyes equally. I think would it be better if everybody was exposed to both messages? Maybe, but I'm not sure it would change fundamentally the fact that the parties want to build different worlds, and people know that, and the stuff that we're writing policy over is really hard. How about all the way in the back, and then we'll come up to the front.
Thank you. I used to be a business professor, so I look at the money end of things.
Okay.
And what I find interesting is I voted for Reagan in '84. I'm an older guy.
Everybody voted for Reagan in '84.
But in my experience, Reagan was the first person told a big lie that he sold. He said, I can cut taxes greatly and balance the budget. Big lie. Deficits exploded. He and Tip O'Neill got back together, and they made it a little bit better. Now, it seems like Americans want to believe the big lie on both sides of the aisle. The Republicans even more so. I mean, Trump was selling this in 2016 that, gee, I can slash taxes and balance the budget. He was even talking about paying off the debt. Now radio silence on balancing the budget because it was a big lie. Nikki Haley was right. Deficits, the national debt went up about $7.8 trillion in Trump's 4 years. Just about as bad under Biden. Neither party is honest about it, and Americans don't want to hear it. The fact that we're simply overspending. It seems to me that part of this goes back to the information silos. I'm old enough to remember when the parties were more honest about revenues and expenses. And now it seems like everybody's living in an alternate reality, and Trump seems to have made it that much worse.
Yeah.
How do you see that?
Well, I think one of the things is what you said, it's complicated, right? Math is complicated, and if you're a candidate, you know, nobody wants to get out the whiteboard and have the candidate start doing math, right? There's no faster way to lose a room, right? Okay, so it's complicated, it's hard to explain. The second thing is that if you're a candidate, so I'm not talking about like what would be right, I'm just answering like why don't they do it. If you're a candidate and you start talking to people about how you shouldn't spend money that you don't have, everybody spends money they don't have. And so if you seem to be chiding people for deficit spending, credit card spending, having a loan, you are chiding everybody. And then you're out of touch, right? So this is hard. And you know, like you think about Paul Ryan, he really wanted to have a conversation about the budget. It's what he loves. And he wanted to talk about it a lot. And man, like there was no appetite for that. Like people basically patted him on the head. Oh, look how cute he is. He wants to talk about the numbers all the time. You know, it's not appealing to people. And I think that's why they don't do it. I don't think it's that there's, you know, they want to lie about it or they want to pull the wool over voters' eyes. They don't want them to know. I think it's mostly that you get in a room like this and you know what you can say to connect with people. And that stuff is really hard to connect on. And there's no good solution that is going to be easy to implement. And the last thing candidates want to do is say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z in my first term when they know they can't do that. It's going to be so hard. So I think it's probably not nefarious, but just a byproduct of, you know, credit card debt, I looked at this a while ago, is higher now than it was in the 1980s. So this is like everybody's doing this, not just the government. Okay.
Thank you for the great presentation. Learned a lot.
Thanks.
So this concept of calcification is interesting to me, and it seems like you're posing it as a more general phenomena. And I'm curious to know to what degree this is a product of Trump. And it seems like, to me, Trump is a very distinctive candidate. So you talk about candidates, the population or the public learning. Well, people know kind of what Trump is about. And so the fact that there's not a lot of switching from 2016 to 2020, and maybe not the case, maybe not people switching from 2020 to 2024, that might not be such a bizarre phenomena to me because people have a clear sense of Trump, and he's been in all three of these elections, and he has a very idiosyncratic political persona.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the way we can test your idea about whether it matters that it's the same candidate, Trump. Okay, let's do just that it's the same candidate first, then we'll do Trump specifically, is looking at the unexpected swap from Biden to Harris. And I have to say that when I didn't think Biden was going to leave, and when, you know, that Sunday when I was out for a walk and I heard some lady on the other side of the sidewalk saying, oh my God, Biden dropped out. And I was like, what? You know, like what is happening? I really didn't expect it. But in that moment, I thought to myself like, oh man, here is the biggest test of calcification ever, right? Because I thought in the middle of the campaign, different candidate, everything kind of changes, or does it? And so that swap, you know, if this election is still on the knife's edge, razor close, like I'm telling you I think it's going to be, then that's a good test of whether the candidate matters or not. And it will, if it is close, it will tell us that it didn't matter that they swapped candidates, in my view. Okay, but you're asking like Trump specifically because he is, you know, the way he campaigns and the way he talks and what he talks about really sort of ignites these divisive issues. And does it matter that it's him? And I think that what I would say about that is that, you know, he has demonstrated that You can win or almost win by talking about these issues. You don't have to talk about them the way he's talking about them, but this is a winning strategy for Republican candidates. And having demonstrated that, it will be very hard for a Republican presidential candidate who wants to win an election to come in and say, I know everybody wants to talk about immigration and abortion and the border and, trans policy, but I'm going to talk about prescription drug prices and colonizing the moon. Right? That was a Newt Gingrich favorite, was colonizing the moon. He talked about that a lot in 2012. It's not meeting the moment, so it's a risk. You don't know. No one's ever won by talking about those things. But you do know that someone did win by talking about these other things and then almost won, and whatever happens in 2024. So I think having demonstrated this as a winning strategy, it's going to be very hard for other candidates not to come in that same lane. They don't have to do it the same way, and maybe that will make politics feel different. Maybe that will turn down that emotion, but my guess is that a lot of the emotional element of politics is because these issues are so personal for people. These are about our friends and our loved ones and our family members, and that is personal for people, and they get emotional about it in a way that you didn't about the tax rate, or when Reagan joked, right? What's the thing people hate the most to hear? Knock, knock, knock. Hi, I'm from the federal government. I'm here to help. Right? That was the New Deal. Decrease the size of government. Government can't solve your problems. That wasn't personal for people in the same way that these policies are. So, I think that if Trump is no longer on the American political scene, it will take a real political leader to come in and be the Republican nominee and not continue down this path. And I'm not sure there are too many people like that out there, like just in either party. That's a big ask, a real political entrepreneur. So sorry if that's I think everybody thinks like, oh, if the candidates were just different, all this would be different. And I don't think that's where we are. Yes. Oh, sorry.
I'm going to sneak in a question quickly, and then I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Dobbs decision and abortion are going to reinforce the trend lines that you're describing here from 2016 and 2020? Or is it going to shake things up? And I'm thinking about like the Kansas election, red state, how it was dramatically different than we expected.
Yes.
And just the gender shakeup, obviously, it follows trend lines, but it seems dramatic in terms of where men are breaking and women are breaking on this one.
Yes. So I think that, yes, that is very important to this election cycle. I want to just issue a little warning of thinking about Kansas and thinking that that's meaningful for 2024. That's like an election where the only thing at stake is abortion policy. In 2024, there's a lot more. A vote for one side or the other changes the world in many, many more different ways than just abortion policy. So if you're someone for whom this is kind of an important thing, but not the most important thing, then when you go to the election in Kansas where it's the only thing on the ballot, you don't have to trade off your preferences on anything else. But in the 2024 election, if it's not the most important thing to you, then all those other things that are ahead of it, maybe that's the environment, maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's taxes, you're trading off all those things to get what you want on this policy that isn't as important to you as the others. No, you're probably going to stick with your vote on what's important to you. So, but it does tell us that there are votes out there to get. And so I think that it is important. And I think that Harris will pick up a lot of votes because of it. But my guess is that she's also losing a lot of votes because of it. And so at the end, maybe it ends up a net benefit for the Democrats, but not a very big one. The thing that it's easy to forget when you think about campaign dynamics is the dynamic part of it. People are always moving in to a category, but lots of people are moving out as well. And so that's why sometimes the polls stay flat and people are like, wow, nothing is happening. No, a lot's happening, right? People are moving in and out of these categories. We're just not seeing it because we're often only taking snapshots instead of looking at the same people over time.
My name is Henry. I'm a junior here. I'm a Wayne Moore Scholar. Really appreciate you coming and chatting today. My question goes back to the last chart that you showed with Harris getting more of the undecided voters. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming that's nationwide, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know the stats specifically in the swing states?
What a great idea. I should have done that. I got to give this talk on Thursday. I'm going to do that for Thursday. I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah, that's a great idea. I should have done it. Which states would you include?
Well, Pennsylvania.
Yep.
First.
Yeah.
Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada.
Georgia? Okay. Carolina? Okay. All right. All right, that's what I'm going to do on Thursday, and I'm going to credit the fine students at the University of Oregon for that. Okay. Over here? Oh. Yeah, go Ducks.
So in the list of issues that matter most to voters, the one I didn't see is maybe the one that matters the most to many people in this room, and that is allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. Mm-hmm. Does that not matter to most voters?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on what you mean by matters. I mean, clearly a lot of people have demonstrated that they're willing to vote for candidates who color outside the lines. And that's, you can think about that not just in 2024. You can think about that throughout the decades. I think what people often say is, oh, well, yes, okay, yes, he did, that was, that's not legal, but, the president did it in the service of the country or something. But, if you're asking why Biden's constant refrain of democracy is on the ballot and this guy is a felon and, in the beginning, Harris I'm a prosecutor. I know from felons. That guy, he's a felon, right? She started her campaign by saying that like 5 times a day, every day. She doesn't say that anymore. And, my guess is that you're right. It's baked in. This is baked in already to how people have divided themselves. So for the people for whom it matters, they've already sorted. So this isn't new information. That would be my guess. But I don't know what percentage of the electorate would say that it matters that the president doesn't break the law. I haven't seen data like that. Okay, did I see? Yeah. Okay, sorry, we'll get you. Okay.
So as a newcomer to the notion, I find the idea of calcification both utterly convincing and
Excellent. Oh.
It leads me to wonder if you have advice and suggestions for people of good conscience who have trouble getting past the perception that adherents to the other party are either cruelly misinformed or remarkably stupid.
Yeah, I do have a piece of advice for you, and I'm sure this is not really what you were thinking, but the first thing that I would tell you to do is over the weekend or last week, Ezra Klein on the Ezra Klein podcast sat down with Pete Buttigieg, and they talk about this exact topic, and I would recommend this interview to all of you. This part of the conversation comes well past halfway in. It's a great conversation, but this part I thought was really good. And basically, Ezra Klein asks Pete Buttigieg to explain to him what Buttigieg thinks the appeal is for people for Trump's message, particularly about immigrants. And Buttigieg's answer is, the reason I like it is that in a lot of the ways that really great communicators and politicians meet people where they are, right? Buttigieg says you have to understand people to understand why there's receptivity to the idea that new people came in and you didn't get what you thought you were going to get. You agreed to a deal. Let's have more trade. Let's change these jobs. Let's pivot. Bill Clinton, 1992, a new economy for the new century. Like this all of this starts there. And, and it starts earlier than that. But, for this answer, it starts like in the 90s. The economy is changing. Jobs are changing. Hang on with us. Hang on. We're going to retrain you. And, and then there's going to be a bigger pie, and your piece of it is going to be bigger, and you're going to be doing better than you were at this factory job. And then we have immigration, and like some of that happened. The pie got bigger, but that slice for a lot of people didn't get bigger. And in fact, some of them never got another slice. And so then at the same time, you have all of these people coming in, and their lives are getting better. Well, okay, their lives started out really bad, but their lives are getting better. My life is staying the same. I signed up for this deal. I didn't get my pie slice, and there's grievance. And it's all about understanding that, where that grievance comes from. And so Buttigieg is like, I think, a once-in-a-generation communicator, so he says it a lot better than I just did, which is why I recommend the interview. But the way he talks about it, we were talking earlier, another book I would recommend to you is a book by a sociologist from Berkeley called Strangers in Their Own Land. Her name is Arlie Russell Hochschild. And this book is really, really good. And it talks about this exact question: why is there receptivity to this message? And so I think that, those two things will help get you to a place where you don't think that this is just misinformation or, a lack of aptitude for understanding logic or something, right? That this is real. And it's, this is a real problem that, real candidates ought to be paying attention to. It's just gotten highly politicized in a very divisive way. And that's making it very hard to communicate about. So those two books. I would actually add a third book, but I know you guys are gonna think you're gonna roll your eyes at me, I can tell, but I would recommend Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance's book. It's really good. And he tells a story about his family. It's a memoir, okay? It's not a history book, it's a memoir. So it's the story of his family, but it's also similarly good on understanding where this idea that there's grievance might come from. So I know that we have to go, but I promise. Okay.
Last question.
I'll answer quickly.
Yeah, so thank you for being here. Appreciate that. I didn't vote for Ronald Reagan in 1984, about 17 years too early. So this is kind of like, this question is derived from like an amalgam of all the points and relative to Professor James's question. When you talk about identity-inflected issues, what comes to mind for me is lived experience. Mm-hmm. And authorship bias when we were talking about information silos and things, right? And you may be presented with credible information, but because you have automatically assumed that the author is not worth your time, you're gonna discredit that. So I follow my local elections in my hometown pretty closely, and I've noticed that lived experience matters in terms of maybe mitigating calcification. Yeah. Right, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And I use wildfire policy as an example of that, right? Like when your house burns down, and your local harbor commissioner or your local city mayor is now campaigning on some pretty liberal green initiatives to fight climate change, right? Those positions are far less divisive, when your house has now been burning down for years, right? So how does lived experience and like that kind of authorship bias, how does that fit into like the national elections? Because obviously it's far more powerful at local and regional elections because you have that. Your neighbor is now the mayor. How does that fit into possibly mitigating, the extreme calcification that we're seeing, right? Yes. Like, how can we tie that in? Yeah,
great question. I'm going to try to answer this quickly. So you're right that the effects of this kind of thing are going to play out more at the local and state level than at the federal level. So let's start there. But one of the things that I think is, and I'll just say another thing on that before we move off of it, is another thing we know from social science research is that when you have in-depth conversations or meaningful experiences with people who are different from you, or when new information, your neighbor's house, burns down or floods or something, that does move people. It doesn't change their attitudes forever, but it changes them for a little while. And so that kind of personal experience has been shown to change people's minds for a short period of time. But this is one thing that I think is interesting. I have a couple of students at UCLA working on this question of, the way I talk to them about it is when policy knocks on your door. So for them, they're interested in gun violence. So you live in a neighborhood and then there is a violent mass shooting. And then what happens to attitudes about gun policy in the surrounding community? And I have a student who used a huge amount of data, 500,000 people interviewed over a year, where there were 14 mass shootings in the country. And he geocoded all the people and all the shootings, and he looked for the concentric circles moving out in distance from the events, and then moving out in time. Okay, so comparing before and after in the same place, and then comparing people close, farther, farther, farther. And there were, on this particular survey, there were lots of questions on gun policy. And we thought this was like a complete winner of a project. Like, what an amazing idea to test. There's all this work in political science showing politics has nationalized. The two parties are really different, people know it, and everything is like, if you're a Democrat, you stand for these things, everybody knows it, and it's the same everywhere. And we thought, like, this project is really gonna take a bite out of that, because for sure, these events move people in these communities. And man, are there no results. So it was just shocking to all of us. And we banged on this data like every way we could think of. And people's attitudes are really sticky. It wasn't even like the people who lived within 10 miles of these events, 1 week after, nope. No change in their preference over universal gun background checks, limiting magazine, there were 6 policy questions. So I think that on the local level, people have shown that this does make a difference. But nationally, this idea that politics is already structured so differently, this is a real structural thing, and it's incredibly hard. COVID couldn't do it. These events can't do it. So I think this is where we are for at least the next, at least the next decade, if not longer. And on that happy note, I will thank you guys so much. This was really fun.